Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, developments around the use of plastic versus glass bottles and which of these is actually safer for you, a possible use for scorpions in treating cancer, but not really yet, a switch in the brain that will turn off binge drinking and avoid all sorts of embarrassing events at things like spring break. FDA has an approved drug that is used for sleeping, but could also help in slowing down Alzheimer's disease, in theory. Man experiences a terrifying result of going to see a chiropractor. How it is that casino lights are almost encouraging you to make bad decisions. Science fiction is being recreated in real life with sea slugs. What may have killed the Neanderthals, according to physics. The Springer Nature is more or less publishing fraudulent research, and very obviously so, and the 2032 city killer asteroid that will hit the moon might actually have an impact on Earth, specifically our satellites. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with news that's probably making headlines at the moment. Glass bottles contain more microplastic than plastic bottles or aluminium cans. Let that sink in for a moment. The research is saying that there is more microplastic in something that is largely plastic-free. This might sound like it's complete nonsense, and at first glance it really is, but the French National Agency research does have more to it than just the weirdness that we're talking about. There is, theoretically, a good explanation as to what's going on here. First of all, we know fairly well at this point that microplastics show up in all sorts of weird places, so they're not good for you. And this has effectively sparked the research. Looking at the different kinds of containers, glass, plastic, and metal, primarily aluminium, and how much microplastic is present in this. The average was 100 microplastic particles per litre in glass bottles, so that's not great. But what's important here is that that was up to 50 times higher than that in plastic bottles or metal cans. And you might think, but why are you detecting any plastic in a metal can? It's metal. Well, no, typically speaking, things like, say, a Coca-Cola can or similar do come with a very thin plastic liner inside them. It's kind of essential given you have what is effectively a mild acid in the form of the carbonation process that would eat away the can if it weren't there. So there is a small amount of plastic present, but as noted, significantly less so than elsewhere. The reason why glass might, and this is a very, let's say, a questionable mechanism, have a greater plastic content and explain what's going on here, is that there are small scratches, basically invisible to the naked eye, but it can be seen under a very good microscope, in the caps that are used on glass bottles. These paint scratches might be what's imparting the microplastics to the content. It kind of tells you about how much we're talking about here. It is tiny, tiny amounts. Now, by contrast, other containers are less of a concern, but they do still occur. For example, wine bottles do still have microplastics in them, so it's better, but not perfect, where it has about 4.5 particles per litre, and that's for a glass bottle, 1.6 for plastic bottles. So even in terms of other beverages, we're not seeing a huge improvement. The key thing here is going to be whether or not the dose is actually of any significant concern, because frankly at this point in time, they've found numbers, but they've not related those numbers to anything meaningful. So don't panic, but bear in mind that not everything that glitters is gold, and in this case, not everything that looks better for you is actually better. In related news about dosage issues, we have touching receipts and claims that they cause toxicity. This is very similar to the news about microplastics in glass bottles. The only difference here we're talking about is that there's actually a very well established exposure from ink, where ink does have a certain amount of metal in it, and the metal is basically printed onto the paper. In other instances, the paper is heat reactive, which uses a slightly different process, so doesn't necessarily rely on having metal in it. The key thing here, though, is how much are you actually getting exposed to? And the answer is practically nothing. you basically have to go along and molest a whole box full of printer paper for receipts before you'd even begin to get a measurable amount of exposure. And we literally mean that. You have to be so involved with these receipts at that point in time that you might as well be recreating the Scrooge McDuck diving into a gold pit sort of event, but with paper. That is how much you need to deal with these. And even then, the actual impact on you, it's almost non-existent. So this is sort of a nothing news item, but also an example of how something can be picked up as a headline and run with despite being nonsense. In the same vein, although this time slightly more promising, it's Amazonian scorpion venom used for breast cancer cells. Yeah. It's important to point out here that there are 3 things to know. 1, this is breast cancer cells, and was anything in a test tube study, basically anything will work no matter what you do, because you can either up the dose, the cells can sometimes be a bit temperamental, there are all sorts of ways. So anything done in a test tube is really only an initial proof of concept, not an actual proof of anything. 2, the scorpion venom is by its nature a venom, and therefore will cause harm. So as it stands now, it's completely useless. 3rd and finally, we have breast cancer is very vague. There are a plethora of different kinds of breast cancer out there, whether it's ductal cells, mammary glands, the various lipids. There are all sorts of cells that become cancerous. So this research may be effective with one kind of breast cancer and none of the others. Yeah. So looking at the actual research, we do have something a little bit more useful, but again, we're talking here about things like exposure, dose, and so on. So what they have done is they've taken the DNA from the scorpion, they've managed to extract the relative genes from this, and they've put them into a vector. That vector is then allowed for the production of the venom effectively within the cells in question, and the venom has then caused those breast cancer cells to no longer be breast cancer cells, or at least not survive. Now, in theory, this could be great, possibly, for treating breast cancer if you could, say, theoretically target only the cancerous cells. But again, that is a big challenge. In related genetic engineering news, we do have something more useful. That is, E. coli has been modified to be able to turn plastic into a relatively common pain relief product, paracetamol, more properly called acetaminophen. Acetaminophen is one of the world's major pain relief drugs or analgesics. It is very important, and it is on the UN's world list of essential medicines. So being able to make it, especially out of something like plastic, which is typically a waste product, would be incredibly beneficial. Right now you have to go through a series of steps basically to synthesize it, and it is something of a pain. But it's not impossible. In fact, it's rather obviously possible given the wide-scale use of acetaminophen. However, that doesn't mean there aren't better ways to do it. So in this case, taking PET plastic, which is, well, a plastic used in things like, say, soft drink bottles, which apparently are better for you now, and being able to insert a gene that modifies this PET plastic into a microorganism, E. coli, you can create acetaminophen. What you essentially get is a PET plastic entering the E. coli. The E. coli turns it into PABA. A PABA gets turned into a different drug again via metabolism. The metabolism process breaks it down into what is effectively a cyclic ring, an amine group, and a hydroxyl group. That then gets broken down a little bit further and modified, and then they end up basically with the same product, but with an acetyl group attached to it. And this winds up with your, effectively, acetaminophen. The whole thing does take about 24 hours, but when you're considering that it's essentially a pure biological process, no scientist is really involved in the room to do anything to it, you don't really have that much investment. And it does get a roughly 92% yield out of whatever goes in, which, again, isn't so bad. You should also note that although this is only applicable to PET bottles, it could theoretically work for a whole raft of other things, and both in terms of plastics and drugs that are being made from it. Shifting to news that will somewhat disappoint the alcohol industry, and probably teenagers everywhere, there is apparently a switch in the brains of mice to stop drinking. Now, this is not going to be particularly popular because alcohol is essentially humanity's social lubricant, and arguably the cause of many, many embarrassing stories and injuries. The problem with it is that at the moment, people are drinking younger and younger, as little as 12 years old, which that's really young for binge drinking. Like, that is literally the age at which some people are currently, according to various studies, is said to be binge drinking. That is, consuming 5 or more drinks in one day, which, depending on how you view these things, may or may not be binge drinking, but nuances aside there. The research is questionable, let's call it, purely because it is rodent-based, so this may not ever transfer to humans, especially since we're talking about particular regions of the brain in mice that, even if they humanize the mice, may not be present in humans. So by taking these various sections of the brain, they're able to figure out this is the parts that will cause an increased risk, if not the act of binge drinking, and they've done so using red fluorescent proteins via genetically modifying said mice, and specifically targeting alcohol-sensitive neurons. Finding these specific locations this way, they're then able to go, okay, if we can somehow either modify or interact with these parts of the brain, or we can downregulate drinking, and in turn, theoretically, and this is again a very big theoretical, provide some sort of, let's say, set of brakes that can be applied to heavy drinking, which might help those who are addicted much more than something like AA does. In terms that are more useful, let's say, something that's better than Ozempic, which might be the catchphrase for a lot of things in the future, given that Ozempic has more or less become the current set minimum threshold for losing weight. This strategy is supposed to be better than it, but it does come from New York University research. What they found is that, well, sleeve gastrectomy, essentially a gastric bypass operation, and they were testing this against semaglutide or tirzepatide, essentially Ozempic. Let's just make it easy for everybody. And they found that simply reducing the size of someone's stomach is actually better at controlling their consumption of food. Who would have thought? Eating less is better for losing weight. This is important because Ozempic is great in the short term for losing weight. Basically, take drug, lose weight. But once people stop taking the drug, they gain weight. The gastric bypass surgery provides not only the immediate benefits of gradually losing weight, which is better for you, but also ensures that you can't suddenly start eating a significant amount of food again later on. You basically run the risk of doing that and then getting a gastric perforation or similar, which having your stomach explode on you because you ate too much is a very good motivator not to eat too much. People in the surgery group lost about a quarter of their total body weight over 2 years, whereas those on Ozempic lost about 5%. So notably, there's about a 5-fold increase in benefits from surgery. There is the very big elephant here to mention that one of these is surgical and therefore very invasive and obviously consequentially very expensive, especially if you're American, and the other is effectively an injection once a day or thereabout. So yes, the benefits versus costs ratio here is somewhat in favor, to an extent, for those who are going to be using Ozempic. But if you are morbidly obese, as the vast majority of Americans are at this point, it's very much worth considering gastric bypass. But then again, can you actually afford it, and will your insurance pay for it? In things that your insurance may pay for, especially if you're American, FDA-approved sleeping drug could theoretically help with Alzheimer's disease, which this is really good if true. It's important to remember that FDA approved means that the drug has generally passed all the typical safety tests for the dose it's being used at for the purpose it's been approved for. Therein lies the catch though. If you're applying it to a new application, you have an established safety profile at a dose. If you're using it at the same dose for a new thing, much easier to get approval. FDA will look at this and go, okay, we know the dose is okay, and we know that you're now showing us data that says it works this way, and you've given us good data. Approval goes through. It takes a few years, it's fairly straightforward. If the dose is different, however, significantly more hurdles, because now you have to rerun all those clinical trials proving the higher dose is, or lower dose is safe, and the effect is there at that dose. The drug in question is called lemborexant, and it is used for sleep. What it also does is reduce abnormal tau. And tau is the protein bundles in the brain that build up over time and effectively cause Alzheimer's disease and other neurological degenerative diseases, so dementia and others. this is good if it works, and it's important to say if it works because theoretical evidence, in this case primarily rodent-based research, will not always translate and typically does not translate to human-based research. So yeah, we're optimistic, but we're also very skeptical. And now for what could be kindly described as case studies that will probably make you very queasy. First of all, we have a CT scan. CT scans are fairly typical, they're not that exciting. Except when a 73-year-old woman comes in and finds a 30-year-old calcified fetus in their abdomen. Let's reiterate that. The fetus has been calcified, and effectively that means that it's been turned into bone in their pelvic region and has been there for 30 years. Given the nature of YouTube, we'll leave it at that because we're likely to lose this video if we actually explain how this has happened and give you proper details, but yeah. In even more horrifying news that does run the risk of our YouTube overlords punishing us excessively, man paralyzed, now experiencing locked-in syndrome because of chiropractor. Chiropractors by their nature are essentially bullshit. They are high risk, very minimal if any reward, practitioners. We are loath to call them medical practitioners, but theoretically. Anyway, long story short, man went in for a neck adjustment in his 20s and came out with locked-in syndrome.
So, Homer, you think you can fix my sciatica?
I don't know what that is, so I'm gonna say yes. Now go limp.
I'm limp.
1, 2, better not sue.
Hey, it worked! My shearing leg pain is now a gentle numbness.
This is not a new event. This is not something unusual. This is something that has occurred on multiple occasions and will probably continue to occur as long as chiropractic is recognized as some sort of medicine. In medical news that is actual medical news, but demonstrates the system sort of has worked at long last, although for all the wrong reasons. And David Cartland, a former doctor at this point, has been punished. His punishment is unfortunately only for threatening and harassing fellow doctors. And the guy is essentially famous for being a COVID nutter who thinks that the vaccines are all evil, and he fell off the deep end after that. The results speak for themselves, really. What he's done in the end is been found guilty of misconduct, and it's because he's encouraged his relatively large audience of followers to harass colleagues. 17 allegations were brought, and they've basically all been substantiated. While we facetiously call him a former Dr. Cartland, it may not cost him his medical license, but he may wind up in a situation where he essentially has a whole raft of sanctions applied against him for his 17 rather terrible acts, and in turn is therefore having to, say, operate under supervision, has to undergo training or something similar. Unfortunately, we don't know what that is yet. Shifting to what is high-risk news, well, not as high risk as telling your thousands of followers on, say, X to harass someone, but casinos. And the fact that casino lights could be tricking your brain into taking significantly higher risk strategies than you otherwise would. Gambling, but gambling on a much larger scale. What's going on here is that for some reason, the extra use of blue lights, particularly in casinos, seems to have an effect on the human brain, and it makes us somehow less sensitive to losing money, but also less sensitive to gains of money. Meaning that, well, if, to a certain extent, you were to be at a table where you were playing blackjack, roulette, poker, or whatever else it is you choose to play, or one-armed bandit, you gain money, and you're like, okay. And if you lose money, it doesn't hurt as much. You're like, oh, go again. And this could, to an extent, explain some of the issues, particularly around those who are, let's call them, chronic users of various lottery or gambling machines. While there's a theoretical argument here that this information could be used, particularly in, nefarious ways by casinos to design their environment to more actively encourage problem gambling, it's also theoretically on the other side of things able to be used by governments to, say, regulate the environment, which could be useful in reducing problem gambling. But The issue here is that it's a very small study. Very small. 15 volunteers between 18 and 27, and they basically had to undergo hypothetical gambling. So, yeah. And now to animal news that could translate to humans one day, eventually, in the very, very distant future, and possibly in another galaxy. How it is that bats avoid cancer. Now, for what they are, bats should be fairly prone to cancer. They survive for long enough, they undergo all these same general biological processes, so they should get enough genetic mutations that at some point cancer would occur. But no. This raises a fairly big question. Since they should only really live about 4 years, and they can live up to 40 years, they should at some point develop cancer. And what they've found is that they have multiple copies of a gene that is in humans. It's the p53 gene, and that's the tumor-suppressing gene that humans use. Admittedly, this approach is not a unique phenomenon. Larger animals, like elephants, also have a significantly greater number of copies of this particular gene. Elephants, for instance, have 20, so it would appear, theoretically, that increasing the number of the copies of this gene in the human genome could theoretically be of benefit. Theoretically, yes, but in practice, not so much. There is at least hope, and this is again somewhat, let's say, theoretical, that using drugs that would target the p53 gene in humans would provide much of the same effect. In something we're not going to get the same effect from, at least not anytime soon, sea slugs are stealing parts from their prey and using them to gain power. Now, we've seen this somewhere before, except we're fairly sure at the time it was either a video game or a book, or possibly both.
To the beginning, behold, Xeras, birthplace of the Zerg. Here the Zerg evolved, and here the Dark One altered them. Those left behind are the primal Zerg. They fight. They kill. They evolve.
The Zerg and the Charids are, well, particularly notorious for it. What we're looking at is the bizarre sea slug called the lettuce sea slug, Elysia crispata. And what it does is it eats algae to get energy, but it doesn't just do that. What it does is it takes the organelles that make energy from the algae that it consumes, these are called chloroplasts, and use them on itself. This is not as crazy as it could be, but it's certainly towards the top of the list of weird stuff that nature has achieved. By itself, just stealing the chloroplasts wouldn't actually be all that useful, mostly down to the fact that, well, they do go through a digestive tract, so first of all they get shunted off to a different process and stored safely. Then from there, those small safe areas are converted into small sacs. These small sacs are ironically called kleptosomes, klepto being for stealing, and these kleptosomes allow the chloroplast to be kept alive and functional. By itself, the kleptosome is not so useful, except that it shuttles off the chloroplasts to the top of the weird sea slug, and that allows them to provide energy to the slug without needing food, or at least not the same food that it originally consumed. It's well known that a poorly fed sea slug will turn orange, and a better fed sea slug will turn green. The question then is simply, how long can they survive, based purely on the use of these chloroplasts, and to an extent, is it semi-symbiotic, or is it literally, much like the mitochondria in humans, something that is, let's say, stolen and kept? Going to news that's, let's say, queasy. Flesh-eating flies are getting across America. Yes, you heard that correctly. The flesh-eating parasitic flies have found their way to North and Central America, and this is not great. The New World screwworm, which was originally gone rid of, has come back, and we would argue come back with something of a fury. The New World screwworm is a fly that will be attracted to the odor of basically any open wound. And the problem is that the larvae it lays, maggots, will feed very aggressively on not just the damaged tissue, which is what most fly larvae will do, but instead on the perfectly healthy and living tissue. That's not fun as it is, but it's worth remembering that the flies will not just feed on this local tissue as larvae, but then grow up and become adults, and then come back and lay more larvae, essentially leading to the death of a host as it's slowly eaten alive. The reason the USA was able to get rid of the screwworm fly larvae in the first place was a very effective, very simple technique, let's call it, the sterile insect technique. Like with other species like mosquitoes, you effectively have a sterile male partner. That sterile male partner will mate with the female, but the female only mates once. Because of this, you can slowly and definitively eradicate them by simply having them not be fertilized. And because they only mate once, any attempt thereafter just doesn't work, meaning that they slowly but definitively get killed off. At the time, this cost hundreds of millions of dollars, verging on billions, but it did come with a benefit. By 1982, the population of screwworm was gone. It was extinct in the USA. It had quite literally screwed off. The problem is that, well, it was the end of the line for that particular approach, because once it's done, you really can't stop them coming back. And so now we have what's happened. The Panama has, on a regular basis, provided effectively a barrier by releasing millions of sterile flies, and this has prevented the New World screwworm from spreading up into America. Despite that, there appears to have been essentially evolution of the female screw flyworm, that it has avoided sterile males in particular, along with environmental conditions and a range of other factors, that has led to the spread into North America. In other news related to extinction, we had the Neanderthals, and ironically, physicists have an idea about what caused it, which is typically not what happens here. Normally, Neanderthals and explanations as to their extinction is the purview of anthropology and archaeology exclusively. Physicists have been reaching out recently, and their theoretical answer as to what's going on here could be useful. It could being a very hesitant word there. What they're looking at is plasma, and that plasma from the sun in particular may have caused a shift in the Earth's magnetic poles. This is called the Landschaft event. How a shift in the magnetic poles and the extinction of Neanderthals are related is a little more tenuous, let's call it. What they think happened is that as our protection via the magnetic field weakened for a particular period of time, it allowed for more ultraviolet radiation to enter Earth, and that would have, including humanity, had a very negative effect on all species. Admittedly, Neanderthals had a worse situation, and therefore, essentially, humans outcompeted them. This is, let's call it interesting as a hypothesis, and maybe one of, let's say, many factors that came into play. After all, it's not like it's the only explanation. This would be a very large-scale, multifactorial event that required a whole bunch of different things fitting together at just the right time. Shifting to a related topic, but this time looking purely at food production at the moment, we have an article saying that at the moment, if you continue the current rate of climate change, there will basically be a notable drop in every kind of crop out there, barring rice. As such, just about every foodstuff that is typically used would go down, again, barring rice. And this is not great, because at the moment we can currently meet demands for food, mostly, assuming the distribution of food is effective, basically the challenge of logistics. But right now that's sort of a secondary concern. If you account for that and everything else, you basically have all your staples gone though. The wheat's going to go down, barley, corn, everything will struggle. So this is not great. Exact losses based on this model are fairly concerning, with somewhere between a 23 and up to 34% loss of productivity. Admittedly, the losses and that range is based on a notable time frame. It's expected by 2050, so roughly 25 years from now, we're going to see a loss of 23% in productivity, and by 2100, 34%. So you note that there is a particular drop-off in just how much we're losing. But still, at that number, we're basically losing 1% of the yield from things like potatoes, wheat, rice, well, not rice in this case, rather obviously, corn and similar over each year. And that's not cool. Of course, genetic engineering and similar, it could very much counter this, so it's not necessarily the case that it's going to be a complete failure. Shifting to purely academic news now, we have what is essentially identification that Spring and Nature have continued to publish fraudulent research. Yeah, that's not encouraging at all. The slightly more worrying element to this is that on top of effectively knowingly publishing fraudulent research, it's been a very narrow geographical group, let's call it, that have been doing so. Saudi and Egyptian researchers, basically. And the concern is very simply, well, if they're doing this, and they've been doing it for a long time, not only are they contaminating the body of literature around the topics, and therefore wasting the time, resources, equipment, and so on of researchers who are trying to replicate what they're doing for their own research, but they're also wasting the opportunity of the editors and reviewers to review actual useful papers, that they're wasting the money that goes into this research, they're wasting the money that goes into publishing in these publications, and mind you, these journals are ludicrously expensive, and of course, they're actually engaging in unethical and fraudulent conduct, which should be a problem for their institutes. And yet, here we are. It's not like that's a, let's say, unique problem to the Middle East. Instead, we need to go to the UK. A similar example, but even sort of dumber in a way. Somehow, an academic thought it was a great idea to use AI text as part of a book. We're not going to say that using AI isn't common now, but using AI and then doing nothing about it yourself is dumb. So, yeah. And, of course, things do get worse. First of all, the book was titled Advanced Nanovaccines for Cancer Immunotherapy, and it sold for between 100 and 140 euros. That's a lot of money for a book that was basically made up in part. Our biggest criticism of this is not so much that they're more or less relying on AI. As said, people do that, but we would encourage you to use AI, let's say, as a stepping stone towards a final product, not the final product itself, because, well, you wind up in situations like this, where you have a good argument at first. The cancer vaccines and chemotherapy are two different approaches to treating cancer, and their effectiveness can vary depending on the type and stage of cancer, as well as individual patient factors. That's fine, that makes sense. But the following undermines all credibility. It is important to note that as an AI language model, I can provide a general perspective, but you should consult with medical professionals for personalized advice. Yes. And, you should probably consult with a professional to get your book edited and avoid these rather obvious and very clear-cut cases of doing nonsense. More so since this is an associate professor, somebody who will be in a fairly prestigious position and fairly senior position. So Dr. Nanasaheb Thorat is in trouble at the University of Limerick. Sadly, although the book has been retracted, we have zero expectation of this ever actually going anywhere for the researcher in question. We have strong expectations that this will basically wind up with them being given a slap on the wrist and told, do better next time to hide your bullshit. The final news item we have for you this week is all about killer asteroids. Well, not really, but the issue here is simply that the asteroid that's probably going to hit the moon in 2032, if it hits anything of any significance, is going to cause a secondary effect that will cause us problems. So, no, a city won't disappear, but your ability to contact people in between cities might for a time. The very large asteroid, about 60 meters wide, will hit the moon, and because of its rather obvious name, City Killer, it's going to cause a lot of damage. But when it does so, we have another concern. All the material that gets blown off of the moon, assuming it's on a side facing Earth, will rather obviously travel towards Earth. and that is a lot of material, which could come towards Earth and cause harm. Fortunately, most likely, we're not going to see anything actually getting through the atmosphere. There'll be a nice shooting star display as various things get burnt up through the atmosphere as they fall through, but anything not inside that protective layer of gas is going to be a problem, primarily satellites. And this is essentially going to be like taking a shotgun with buckshot in it and firing it at Earth and seeing what it hits. Yeah, that's the problem here. Possibly hundreds of millions of kilograms and millions of pounds of material could come from the moon and fly towards Earth, and it doesn't take much to do a lot of damage. You really only need, let's say, fractions of a centimeter, millimeters, or essentially tenths of an inch size material to destroy a satellite. Whether it's hitting the solar panels, whether it's actually going straight through the functional core of the satellite, or anything else, it is a problem. And this is a huge increase over the normal scattershot approach of things in space trying to destroy humanity, or at least our materials in space. About 1,000 times an increase over the amount that you would expect to see what's going to hit Earth. If we were to draw a very rough comparison, it's going to be like a male on Tinder trying to like every single female they see and hoping that one of them will respond, except in this case, there's a much wider hit area. Now, that's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.